As the Nuremberg trials drew to a close, one face is missing among the Nazis being sentenced. Hans Kammler, Himmler's most brutal and most ruthless henchman, is nowhere to be found. Kammler had never been like the others. He moved through tunnel networks beneath the mountains, working on weapons so advanced that Winston Churchill himself decided to keep them a secret from the world. However, in the final months of the war, it's rumored that Kammler turned his attention to something even darker, something his own peers considered impossible. Buried beneath the Owl Mountains in Lower Silesia, the bizarre bell-shaped device sat in a bunker. Witnesses claimed it glowed, radiated lethal energy, and defied the known laws of physics. It was Kammler's last weapon, and his only bargaining chip to get out. They said it was impossible, but as Kammler's trail went cold, rumors emerged that his weapon actually worked. Someone had taken him somewhere, and no one knew what he actually brought with him. Power grab. On February 10th, 1933, Adolf Hitler stood before a sea of swastikas in the Berlin Sportpalast, delivering a fiery speech to a crowd of officials and fervent supporters. Just days earlier, he'd been appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg. His Nazi party was now the largest in the country, and while some clung to the hope that Hitler could still be controlled, he was about to shatter that illusion. During Hitler's rise to power, the foundations of Nazi terror began to take root. The same year that Hitler became Chancellor, Germany's first concentration camp opened in what used to be an old munitions factory in Munich, under the name Dachau. At first, Dachau was promoted as a detention center for political dissidents, communists, social democrats, and anyone else who dared oppose the regime. Munich's chief of police, Heinrich Himmler, heralded it in the press as a measure to, quote, restore calm to Germany. But before long, Dachau's barbed wire enclosed not only political prisoners, but Jews, Romani, clergy, foreign nationals, and anyone the Nazis deemed undesirable. As Hitler's empire spread across Europe, the Nazi war machine began to recruit a new generation of engineers, bureaucrats, and visionaries, tasked with taking camps like Dachau to the next level, men who saw cruelty as a tool of progress. Among these figures was Hans Kammler, a trained civil engineer and fanatical nationalist, who would quickly turn into one of Hitler's most prominent disciples. The man who dreamed of war. Kammler carried a single regret throughout his life, that he'd been too late to fight in the war that had cost his country years of economic struggle and humiliation, turning 18 a year too late to join the front of World War I. However, as fascism rose across the nation throughout the following decades, Kammler found another path to glory, proving himself a key asset for the Third Reich. His early work as a consultant for the SS Race and Settlement Main Office gave him first-hand involvement in enforcing some of the most twisted racial doctrines that defined Nazi ideology. Under the watch of Kammler, Aryan ancestry became institutionalized, with SS members being forbidden to marry unless they could trace the purity of their fiancés' bloodlines back to 1800. These types of practices would only turn more eerie as the years progressed. Yet members of the Nazi Party were told to see these measures as standard practice, meant to secure the success of the country, no matter how horrifying they might seem. Kammler had no problem with accepting the cruel methods of control used by Hitler. In fact, he praised them. He was the ideal man to serve the Nazis, cold, meticulous, and utterly devoid of conscience. There were no moral lines he wouldn't cross. To him, suffering was a tool to exploit in fulfilling the promise of a 1,000-year Reich. Architect of Evil. Kammler's many postings within the Nazi Party eventually led him to the construction, expansion, and industrialization of the Nazi concentration camp system, which took the model set by Dachau and rapidly evolved into a network across Germany and its occupied territories. But as war consumed Europe, concentration camps were no longer enough. Immediately after Hitler invaded Poland, the Nazis greenlit the construction of Majdanek outside the Polish city of Lublin. It was one of the first pillars of Operation Reinhardt, the codename for the planned mass execution of those deemed undesirable in the newly conquered Eastern territories. Sprawled across acres of land, Majdanek featured over 200 buildings and 7 gas chambers. It went on to hold an estimated 150,000 prisoners throughout the war. Where others might have been horrified, Kammler was inspired. Marveled by Majdanek terrifying efficiency, he ordered the construction of a far larger facility, Auschwitz. Despite frequent shortages of materials and labor, Kammler was determined to get this camp up and running, pushing the construction of Auschwitz forward at a breakneck pace. Without him, perhaps the camp would have taken longer to finalize, or maybe it would have never even existed. However, due to Kammler's incessant efforts, it was operating as early as 1942, with hundreds of trains arriving at the camp in the years that followed. The camp became the crown jewel of the Nazi extermination machine. The complex consisted of 3 main sections and over 40 subcamps, which went on to claim the lives of over 1.1 million people. But as Kammler's crimes grew more heinous, so did his respect and admiration within the Nazi regime. The future of war. Before long, Hans Kammler's reputation earned him the keys to one of the Reich's most terrifying war projects, the secret weapons program. One of Kammler's top priorities was overseeing the creation of an aircraft that would grant the Luftwaffe unchallenged aerial superiority, giving German pilots an edge over anything the Allies had to offer. The project aimed to build the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, an aircraft set to reach a top speed of 530 miles per hour and which held enough firepower to shred enemy bombers and fighters in close-quarters dogfights. It was a technological leap, and engineers wrestled with engine failures, high-speed instability, and Hitler's interference, who continuously insisted on shifting the aircraft's intended role from fighter to bomber. But Kammler, determined to be the most efficient Reich disciple, pushed the aircraft through its final design stages despite the many setbacks. By late 1943, he had the Me-262 rolling off production lines, and by early 1944, the jet finally took off the runway with a set of twin jets that far surpassed the capabilities of even the most advanced Allied aircraft. But air superiority wasn't enough. The Reich also needed long-range destructive capabilities, and once again, Kammler would be the man to deliver. He took control of the V-2 rocket program, the most advanced missile system the world had ever seen. Officially dubbed Vergeltungswaffe II, or Vengeance Weapon II, this 46-foot-tall Titan could soar to the edge of space, reaching altitudes of nearly 50 miles. It was the first man-made object to accomplish this feat. With a supersonic speed of 2,200 miles per hour, the missile struck without warning. By the time you heard the blast, it was already too late. Each one carried a 1-ton warhead, enough to vaporize buildings and tear through streets. Kammler's rockets were unleashed on Allied-held cities: Paris, Antwerp, Liège, and even London. The British capital was struck again and again. Over 1,300 V-2 rockets slammed into the city by the end of 1944. Nearly 3,000 civilians lost their lives, and over 6,500 more were injured. The devastation was so sudden that Winston Churchill ordered the truth to be hidden to keep morale intact. The government blamed the destruction on ruptured gas pipes, not the work of a new Nazi superweapon. It wasn't until the Germans claimed responsibility for the rocket strikes that Churchill had to admit what really had been happening in the city. With Kammler at the helm, Germany now possessed 2 of the most advanced weapons ever deployed in modern warfare. Although they had arrived too late to shift the tide of the war, they were enough to keep sowing chaos and terror on the enemy to the very end. But Kammler wasn't finished, and even as Germany crumbled under the weight of Soviet and American forces closing in from both flanks, it's believed that he continued to oversee the development of increasingly disturbing weapons that seemed to derive from a slow descent into madness. The Wonder Weapon. It's estimated that the Nazi secret weapons program was developing over 100 advanced weapons systems during the final years of World War II, ranging from next-generation submarines and super-heavy tanks to reusable rockets and precision-guided missiles. Among the most bizarre and controversial of the superweapons allegedly developed under Kammler's watch was a device known as Die Glocke, or the bell, an ominous creation that's said to have resembled a giant bell, roughly 13 feet tall and 10 feet wide, housed within secret SS facilities in Lower Silesia. Die Glocke reportedly contained 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with an unknown purple metallic substance, referred to as Serum 525, which, when activated, made the bell emit a blinding blue light, unleash intense bursts of radiation, and according to some theories, produce anti-gravity effects or even control time. According to reports attributed to Polish intelligence officials, dozens of scientists and technicians linked to the project were executed by the SS to protect the secrecy of Die Glocke. Survivors from the Gross Rosen concentration camp are said to have described seeing strange lights pulsing from weapon-building facilities, and even claimed that fellow prisoners succumbed to radiation poisoning after being exposed to the machine. To this day, many argue about the veracity of Die Glocke, with some dismissing it as a myth or post-war conspiracy. However, others speculate that Kammler, obsessed with saving the crumbling Reich, may have begun to greenlight exotic, highly experimental technologies toward the end, hoping for a last-minute miracle and a final fit of fanatic insanity as he witnessed the regime collapsing around him. Kammler's prisoners. Building high-tech instruments of war under immense budgetary and time constraints demanded a relentless, expendable labor force, and Kammler, with his cold, calculating vision, found the perfect solution in the prisoners of his concentration camps. Prisoners were presented with an impossible choice: construct the weapons being used to annihilate their homelands or forfeit their lives. For many, this was enough to pick up a tool and accept the cruel fate of forced labor. Many would go on to work like this for months, years, or however long they could remain useful to their captors. However, even with unlimited access to free labor, Germany's weapons program became threatened after Allied bombing spread throughout Germany and its occupied territories. The Nazis ended up requiring bomb-proof facilities from which they could keep operating, even amid an aerial attack. And officials found the perfect solution beneath the grounds of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp near the German city of Nordhausen. The Konstein tunnels, originally built to store Wehrmacht fuel, became the production headquarters for some of the Nazis' most notorious weapons. Prisoners were forced to live, sleep, and labor inside these suffocating caverns. Conditions were so severe that men collapsed where they stood, and those who grew too weak were discarded like broken tools, replaced by the next batch of workers. Kammler ordered a radical expansion of the tunnels, with prisoners digging deeper into the tunnels day and night, under the constant eye of SS guards, constructing a facility that eventually became one of the most important centers for Germany's rocket program, producing up to 400 V-2 rockets a month. When Armaments Minister Albert Speer visited the site, many members of his staff recoiled at what they saw. Some were so disturbed that they even requested time off after the visit. Speer, however, was impressed and even praised Kammler's work, stating that he had transformed the tunnels, quote, into a factory which has no equal in Europe, and which is unsurpassed even when measured against American standards. Beneath the surface. As Allied bombing raids intensified, the regime began expanding its underground weapons facilities across the Reich, resulting in one of its most secretive undertakings, Project Riese, or Project Giant. Hidden deep within Lower Silesia, in what is now Poland, Riese was envisioned as a vast, bomb-proof labyrinth that went through the Owl Mountains and beneath Krzaw's castle, one of the biggest medieval fortresses in the region. Under the authority of the departments Kammler worked for, thousands of prisoners, many from Auschwitz and other camps, were funneled into the mountains to work on Riese. Of the estimated 13,000 prisoners brought to the site, at least 5,000 never came out. When questioned about the brutal toll of Nazi forced labor, Kammler would simply reply, quote, "Don't worry about the victims. The work must proceed ahead in the shortest time possible." After years of work on the project, the Nazis succeeded in creating an underground network that stretched nearly 6 miles. But before the site could be finished, the war turned on them. As the Red Army surged westward, the project was abruptly halted. Tools were dropped mid-task, and tunnels were left alone as the SS scrambled to evacuate, destroying documents and retreating, dragging some prisoners with them and leaving others behind to fend for themselves. The true purpose of Project Riese remains a mystery. While many believe it was intended as yet another underground industrial complex for the production of Wunderwaffe, others suggest it was to become a fortified Führer headquarters, with Krzaw's castle transformed into a strategic command center for the Nazi elite, a last bastion from which to direct the final defense of the crumbling Reich. Whichever was the final intent for Riese, its future collapsed alongside that of the SS and Kammler himself, as Germany was brought crashing down. The Hunt. As the Allies marched deeper into German territory by early 1945, they understood that capturing or assassinating top Nazi leaders like Hitler or Himmler would be near impossible. Instead, the Allies began to focus on eliminating other powerful figures within the Nazi hierarchy to further destabilize the regime in its final days. At the top of this new hit list stood Hans Kammler. His role in developing the underground weapon facilities and expanding the concentration camp network made him a top target of Britain's Special Operations Executive under the covert plan Operation Little Foxley 1. The Allies believed they had a perfect chance to get Kammler in early April 1945, when the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force ordered the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command to strike the Nordhausen region, where Kammler had overseen the underground rocket complex at the Mittelbau-Dora camp. Kammler, however, was one step ahead. Disobeying orders to defend the area, he arranged an evacuation of roughly 500 V-2 rocket engineers, many of them key figures in Germany's missile program, and ordered the destruction of sensitive equipment along the way. In the wake of the failed bombing, the Allies ramped up efforts to track Kammler. Intelligence services monitored and decoded signals intercepted at Bletchley Park to chart his movements. But Kammler was no sitting duck. In a radio message sent on April 16, 1945 from Munich, he simply told Nazi High Command, quote, "I am myself constantly on the move." According to post-war testimonies, Kammler entertained several escape plans, one of which involved hiding in the nearby Edel Monastery disguised as a monk. Others speculated that he was seeking passage to Soviet lines. However, on May 4, 1945, Kammler launched what would become his actual final known movement. He handed a sealed letter to his aide, SS Sturmbannführer Arthur Strack, to be delivered to his wife. In it, he wrote, quote, "I do not think of putting a stop to all the people entrusted to me by sneaking out of my life in a cowardly way." That same day, his convoy departed from Ebensee in Austria, heading east toward Czechoslovakia. According to his second driver, Kurt Pruk, their route ended not in Prague, but near Freistadt, close to Linz. Then, on May 7th, one day before Germany's unconditional surrender, British intelligence intercepted a radio message sent by Kammler to SS Sturmbannführer Alfons Kraft at the SS Signals School in Leichmeritz, requesting confirmation of his staff's arrival at the town. The reply came the next day, quote, "Stab Kammler has not yet arrived by 6:30, May 7th. This is believed to be the last authenticated message ever sent by Hans Kammler. Vanishing Act. After the collapse of Nazi Germany, as Allied forces swept through the ruins of the Third Reich and rounded up its surviving leadership, Hans Kammler seemed to vanish into thin air. No verified body was ever recovered, and despite countless leads, the fate of the architect behind Hitler's vast system of concentration camps and secret weapons remains one of the war's great mysteries. It appears that Kammler, or perhaps loyal members of his inner circle, orchestrated a plan to erase his trail. In one early account, British troops occupying a bunker in the northern city of Lübeck discovered a body carrying Kammler's identification. However, Kammler was confirmed to have met with Albert Speer more than a week after the supposed discovery. It seemed it had all been just a diversion to mislead Allied investigators. Other theories suggest Kammler took his own life during the chaos of May 1945. One version places this en route to Prague, possibly after being caught in an ambush. Others claim he fell during the Czech uprising, when resistance fighters clashed with retreating German forces in the streets of Prague, his body buried in an unmarked grave. But some believe Kammler's cunning didn't end with the war. According to one theory, he may have assumed the identity of his SS driver, Friedrich Baum, during the group's final escape. Witnesses recall Baum being shot in the left knee during their retreat. But later, hospital records from Gmunden in Austria show that a man using the name Friedrich Baum was admitted with a wound to the right knee and later perished from an infection. That man was buried in a military cemetery, but decades later, his grave was exhumed and found to be empty. To make the case even more suspicious, there's no evidence in military records that any Friedrich Baum ever served in the Berlin motor pool, leaving many wondering if this was just a case of mistaken identity or an alias used by Kammler to escape. Another account claims Kammler was captured by US forces on May 9th, just one day after Germany's official surrender, only to vanish again, this time from Allied custody. While some believe he simply escaped, others whisper a darker possibility. that Kammler was indeed taken by the Americans, but was not lost. Instead, he was taken back to the United States, where he may have lived out the rest of his life in secret, protected for reasons that remain classified. Shadow of a Man. In the years following World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union spiraled into the Cold War, threatening even greater destruction than the war they had just survived. Amid an atmosphere of paranoia, secrecy, and technological arms races, the victors of World War II began going through the ruins of the Nazi Empire, seeking to unearth its weapons, scientists, and secrets. Through Operation Paperclip in the US and Operation Osoaviakim in the Soviet Union, both superpowers brought thousands of former Nazi scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers into new lives within their nations, putting men who had served Hitler into their ranks. President Harry S. Truman had ordered that no individual involved in Nazi war crimes be brought to American soil. But those were just words on paper. In reality, identities were scrubbed clean and records rewritten, leaving the possibility for someone like Hans Kammler to slip through the cracks. Werner von Braun, who had worked under Kammler on the V-2 rocket program, was welcomed into America's space program and later became a key figure at NASA. If Kammler had knowledge deemed useful and expertise in underground construction, logistics, and strategic weapons deployment, he could have also been considered too valuable to discard. However, Kammler's crimes ran too deep, having overseen extermination camps, mass executions, and projects built on the bones of prisoners. If the US had taken him, they would have had to bury any trace of his existence, perhaps even from the president himself. There's no conclusive proof that Kammler ended up in American custody, but some find it suspicious that during the Nuremberg trials, where the Allied powers meticulously prosecuted the architects of the Nazi regime, Kammler's name surfaced only 26 times in over 35,000 pages of testimony and evidence, turning one of Hitler's most indispensable allies into barely a footnote. This could have perhaps been intentional, with external forces either trying to protect him or deliberately attempting to erase his crimes to clear the path for others who worked with him to be recruited without consequence. Whatever the truth, Hans Kammler remains one of the most chilling enigmas of the Third Reich, a man who helped build the nightmares of the Nazi regime only to vanish without a trace, leaving behind a legacy as one of the worst war criminals the world has ever seen.